Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a little time with A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, one of my favorite books of all time. This book was originally published back in 1980. This is a 1987 paperback edition that I read. I picked it up at a charity sale not too long ago and decided it was due for a reread because I originally read this book back in probably the late 80s, probably around the time this paperback came out. And then I reread the book in the about middle 90s for a book club I was in at the time. And when I saw this at the charity shop, I thought, yeah, I need to give this another read. So I'm glad I went ahead and picked it up because it's, as usual, I wondered if I would find it as hilariously funny as I traditionally have, and yep, I did. So, yeah, it's got a weird kind of complicated publishing history. The author, John Kennedy Toole, the book itself was written, from what I can tell, in 1963, and he tried unsuccessfully to get this book published. It was presented to Simon & Schuster, and their editor, Robert Gottlieb, turned it down and said the book had no point. There was no point to it. Well, it wound up winning the Pulitzer Prize when it was published in 1980. The author unfortunately committed suicide in 1969. He apparently had some struggles with some mental health issues, and plus he was depressed partially because he couldn't get the book published. But I think he also had some underlying pretty significant mental health issues going on at the time as well. But his mother never gave up trying to get the book published, and she presented it, eventually took it to the author Walker Percy, and LSU, Louisiana State University Press, ended up publishing the work, and like I said, it won the Pulitzer Prize. So as far as not having a point, it has it definitely has a point. I'll talk more about what I think, some of the kind of the cool takeaway points that I took from the book later on in this chat. But so about this work, so it's called a picaresque novel. So I wrote down the definition of what a picaresque novel is, and it says it is a genre of prose fiction that depicts the adventures of a roguish but appealing hero of low class who lives by his wits in a corrupt society. Picaresque novels typically adopt a realistic style with elements of comedy and satire. Definitely this book has both comedy and satire in droves. So let's get to it. So what it's about, it's set in New Orleans. So in this New Orleans, part of the book is written in the different dialects of New Orleans. So New Orleans is one of these American cities that has a real unique has a real unique character to it. And part of the character comes from the different kind of cultures that have blended in New Orleans to create something really unique. And so these accents, these dialects are featured among some of the characters in the book. So the book opens in front of a department store, and our main character, whose name is Ignatius Riley. So Ignatius Riley is a big guy. He's a really big, well-educated guy who doesn't, however, want to work. He models his life after this book, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. He hates modernity. Modernity, he feels, lacks theology and geometry. So he's often, taking different kind of, not really quotes, but inspiration from Boethius, and this book actually features very prominently the book itself. A physical copy of the book plays a very big part in the story. So yeah, and he also refers frequently to Fortuna, the Roman goddess Fortuna, who, her wheel of fortune sends him up and down the sort of avenues of life. But so it starts out in front of this department store, and Ignatius is waiting on his mother, who's in the department store buying sweets. And a cop comes along, and there's a little crowd that gathers because Ignatius is a very eccentric-looking person. He's a big guy, like I said. He's overweight. He's wearing, like, weird clothes. He wears this green hunting cap. He hates new clothes. He thinks anything new lacks geometry and theology. But, so he's in front of the store. So there's a cop that's like, what are you doing here? Because this cop is actually, his name is Mancuso. He has been tasked by his sergeant to bring in suspicious characters. And so and so Ignatius is obviously a suspicious character, but there's this other crowd that gathers. One of the other members of the crowd is this black guy Jones, and he winds up getting taken in actually by the cops through this, as does this older man named, we find out later his name is Claude, who thinks all cops are communists. Actually, he thinks everybody kind of that disagrees with him or that he is at odds with is a communist, and he calls them communists. So, yeah, that's sort of how the book opens. Ignatius's mother eventually comes out, and they wind up going to get a drink in this seedy bar down in the French Quarter in New Orleans. And the bar is called the Night of Joy. The owner of the bar is Lana Lee. She becomes another major character, as do other people in this bar. But that's sort of how the book opens. Ignatius's mother, whose name is Irene, is a widow, and so they don't have a lot of money, and she got some insurance money not long ago, not that far back in the past, and she spent it all to send Ignatius through college. He got a master's degree, and yet he's never worked and still doesn't work. He's like 30 years old, and he's never really worked. But kind of through other things that happen, they really need some money, so she sends him out to work, and that's really what the book's about, is his different job. He gets a couple of different jobs, and then his interactions with the characters at these jobs. So a few other characters that I wanted to talk about were the Levies. So the Levies are Gus Levy is an owner of a pants factory in New Orleans, and this is a place where Ignatius eventually gets a job. And then he'd have his wife. This couple, though, they're so funny. They're like the quintessential bickering couple, especially the wife. She's always bickering at him. And then they have these two girls who are in college, and their names are Susan and Sandra. So Susan and Sandra never actually appear in the book, but this couple, you know how some couples, bickering couples, will use their children as weapons? Well, Mrs. Levy has learned she's gotten this down to an art and a science of how to use Susan and Sandra as a weapon against her husband. So they're very funny. And then at the pants factory, there is an older lady who just really wants to retire. She's got some kind of like memory issues. She just really wants to be left alone and work. And her name is Miss Trixie. And Mrs. Levy has decided to take her as a project, a psychological project, because she feels like work is giving her meaning and that she has no self-esteem. And so Mrs. Levy took a correspondence course in psychology, and so she thinks she took on Miss Trixie as a project. But Miss Trixie is another one of these unforgettable characters. So back to the bar. So this bar, we have, I mentioned Lana Lee, is the owner of the bar. So through a roundabout thing that happens, so the African American guy who is in the beginning of the book and observing, whose name is Burma Jones, he's this guy that wears these dark glasses all the time and smokes, and so he's always sort of in this cloud of cigarette smoke. Well, she ends up hiring him at the Night of Joy in this sort of seedy nightclub because the cops have arrested him. Mancuso arrested him for vagrancy, and so Lana Lee says she has friends on the police force, and if he doesn't work for less than minimum wage, she'll have him hauled in for vagrancy, So he works there, but he's a very acute observer of the comings and goings of the activities at the Night of Joy. So I'll just say, without giving anything away, there's something else going on at the Night of Joy other than just serving drinks. One thing is, Darlene is a character that works at Night of Joy. At first, she's kind of pushing watered down drinks, but then she wants to have kind of a striptease act, and she finally talks Lana into letting her do this with her pet bird, which is why we have the bird here on the cover. Her pet cockatoo, and yeah, so that's another sort of storyline of Darlene. So there's activities at the bar, at the at the pants factory, and then Ignatius eventually gets another job as well, selling hot dogs. Another character they meet sort of at the very beginning when they're in the seedy bar, the mother and Ignatius, the first time, is Dorian Green. We find out his name is later, and he's this gay guy. So Mancuso, the cop, at the beginning of the novel tries to pick up Ignatius for being a suspicious character. And so it turns out that the police force it thinks of Mancuso as a total failure because he can't bring anybody in. He can't bring in any characters, And so Mancuso sort of prowls. He has to prowl the French Quarter in downtown New Orleans in these various costumes, these various sort of disguises that are extremely ridiculous, like Santa Claus and other kinds of really silly outfits that Dorian Green and the rest of the gay community down in New Orleans finds very funny. Of course, they can recognize him from a mile away. But this sort of activity of the police always on the lookout for either vagrants or trying to arrest really blacks or gays for anything I'll talk more about before we close the chat, because that's, to me, one of the main points of the book. So other characters I didn't mention yet is Myrna. So Myrna is not really Ignatius's girlfriend, but it's someone he met in college, and then she's from New York. And they had maintained a correspondence by mail, and so mostly through the book we get to know Myrna through her letters that she writes to Ignatius. And so while Ignatius doesn't want to work and he doesn't want to engage in the world, he just wants to stay home and write his musings down in these Big Chief tablets, which were, I don't think their Big Chief tablets are around anymore, but they were big line paper, kind of cheap tablets that you used to be able to buy. And so Ignatius just feels kind of like these, only, just a tablet. And Ignatius just fills these one after the other with his different writings. Of course, he always thinks he's going to be able to sell these writings or make some sort of profit on them, but of course he never even really tries. But Myrna, on the other hand, while Ignatius is not engaged with the world at all and actually is repulsed by the world, Myrna, on the other hand, is totally engaged in the world. She's kind of like this beatnik, kind of hippie. Well, it was before the hippies because this book was written in 1963, but she's an activist. So she's always, involved with some sort of experimental play or something like that. She's got a father that gives her money that sort of finances this. So they write letters back and forth, and they have this really love-hate relationship with each other that's just really hilarious to read. So, yeah, before I run out of time, final thoughts about the book. So, this idea, so the point of the book, so I don't know if it has a point other than just being a lot of fun to read, but, as far as the editor, when they turned down the book for Simon & Schuster saying the book had no point, one thing that really struck me, though, was this book was the sort of the satire that we see in the book. We see all sorts of social satire. One of it is the cops and their relationship to the gay community and the African American community, and how they're really looking for something to really just drag them in to the police at any moment. This was in the early 60s, when there was a lot more probably police persecution among gays than now. But it's all kind of done in a humorous way. And then these relationships. Ignatius and his mother's neighbor, Miss Annie. This was during the era, probably they don't have air conditioning, and so everybody can kind of hear. This was during, if you didn't have air conditioning and you lived in a block of people, you would hear each other a lot. Well, Ignatius and his mother drive their neighbor, Miss Annie, really completely bonkers, and she's always yelling at them to be quiet or something. So, but this sort of social satire, to me, was not really the point of the book. The point of the book to me was just to read it and have fun and laugh. I wondered if I would laugh out loud like I have the previous 2 times I've read the book, and yes, I did. I laughed out loud a lot. So I do have this book. I did decide to pick up The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius since it was so important to Ignatius and give this a read. So I'll have this coming up very soon. But my next book chat is going to be American Philosophy, A Love Story by John Kaag. So stay tuned for that. Take care. Bye.